the Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. No longer dialogue conspiracy, which I'm used to stating, but as we said before, this becomes now World Watcher, and this is side one of World Watchers International, because these tapes do go out to other countries. The tapes will be numbered, each side. This will be number 324, June the 2nd, 1978, and the other side will be number 325. The reason is that I will list a subject section that goes out in my mail to people who want to subscribe to shows or past shows, and they can select a half hour of one tape or a half hour of another. They may not want the subject matter that is on both sides. Just as I've sold them out in the past, we've sent them out, and they can select later if they wanted to look at the subjects, if it's on the John Kennedy assassination or mind control or the Mormon Church. Some people like to select the subjects, and once they get into it, most of them fill in and order the back subjects, but some people have a particular thing that they're interested in and can't afford all of the tapes, and so I'm going to have the regular mailing list for those people, and that's why each side of the same tape will be numbered with a different number, but will go to you once a week, those of you who subscribe. I got a lot of reaction to my going off of KLRB in the format that I had, and I really miss it already. I know I'll miss it, but I do think that an hour a week of information going to you will be more valuable, and I think that people who get the tapes will be able to use them to better advantage, to play them over, have people over to listen and talk about it, to take notes. A half hour goes very fast on the air, and the response I get from the people who are taking these tapes is so tremendous that I just would rather broaden out and reach those people by way of the tape cassettes. I have on the list of bibliographies here enclosed each week, you'll get a list, is an article in Inquiry magazine by Ted Zalk. It's an article claiming that the reason Richard Helms was not prosecuted by Jimmy Carter for his perjury in the ITT case is that he would reveal the still secret CIA ties to the large banks of the world. Now, Harry Truman was instrumental in calling off the investigation of Nazi money in the Swiss bank accounts, and as I mentioned before on other tapes, the project to counterfeit millions of dollars of English and American money just prior to the end of World War II under the Operation Bernhardt could be the key to the funding of the Bilderberger organization. And Mr. Truman, as the haberdasher, was not quite an innocent bystander in forming the National Security Council or stopping the investigation of the Nazi money. And this is one of the things that Richard Helms can continue to control, because he was instrumental from immediately after World War II in the organization that became known as the CIA and the sources of their money. I got this week the memoirs of Richard Nixon. I was looking forward to it because of the excerpts I saw in the newspaper, and I don't want you to put it down lightly as something funny. Richard Nixon never was funny, and the problem is that Richard Nixon was always misunderstood for what he really was. His books are marvelous. His Sixth Crisis is wonderful, and I do want to share with you on these tapes just a few pages, time to time, of Richard Nixon's book. I guess I could just open any page and find something interesting and historically valuable about it. But right from the beginning, he starts with his running for Congress in 1966. And on page 33 and 34, as I have in your bibliography there, he tells about his letter from Herman Perry, the manager of the Bank of America, who wrote him a letter and said, "Dear Dick, do you want to run on the Republican ticket? Airmail me your reply, Mr. H.L. Perry." He's very upfront about this letter, and the date is important because Richard Nixon was taken to California to see Mr. Perry, and then he was taken to the bungalow of Howard Hughes, and they decided, yes, this is our man. He had already written to the law offices of Allen Dulles, and it has to be an intelligence work. When he was in the Navy, he had written to the FBI and said he would like to be in the FBI. The fact that he didn't get response from them doesn't mean he wasn't hired. People think, well, he didn't get an answer. His answer probably came in the form of Herman Perry and Howard Hughes, who then contacted him, and he was brought to California to run against Jerry Voorhees. This is an important statement that he makes about being approached by Herman Perry. And then again, I have the page numbers for you to look up in the book, Wanted, Search for the Nazis, how the same Mr. Perry was instrumental in bringing war criminal Nikolai Maloxy to Richard Nixon's office, and then Maloxy of the Odessa went down to Argentine. We'll be doing constant references to the Argentine-Nixon connections. I think they're very important. So that little bit of the book, I think you'll enjoy reading and looking up, and then get the book from the library, the paperback, Wanted, Search for the Nazis, and we'll put those pieces of Nixon together. Also in Richard Nixon's book is a very visual picture, exactly as Charlie Chaplin depicted it in The Great Dictator, and exactly as I depict the way the world leaders sit at the Council of Foreign Relations in the Bilderberger meetings and chop up the world. On page 43, Richard Nixon says, Pat and I went to Washington and saw the inside of the White House for the first time, February 18th, 1947. We went to a reception. Mr. Truman, President Truman, made us feel welcome and relaxed as we shook hands with him. We sat around a desk, and he spoke earnestly about rehabilitating Europe, and he emphasized his concern that peaceful German production should be encouraged. Of course, this is the same Truman in 1947 that said, don't go into the Nazi money in the Swiss banks. And of course, they encouraged German production. He doesn't say in this book that included the IG Farben and the Krupp ammunition makers, but it did. Richard Nixon said he led us over to a big globe where he pointed to Manchuria, and he remarked how rich it was in oil and mineral deposits. And he said the Soviets had devastated that region, but that Manchuria would be recovering and become a productive area for the world. Now, as I say, that's the way Charlie Chaplin held the globe and is a great dictator, and they looked it over. And I can see Truman after the war. This is 1947, and we had Mr. Smathers put in Florida by the same people, and Gerald Ford from Michigan, and Richard Nixon from California. That class of 46 that was elected, and we have to do more research. All of you can help me to look up the history of members of Congress that were elected in 1946. You can go into the biographies of the men that are still there today, or those that passed away recently, and look up how many came in that class of 46, because then in 1947, President Truman, with the help of Nazi war criminals and the OSS and CIA officials, formed what became as the National Security Council, and then foreigners like Henry Kissinger and Mr. Brzezinski come in and run our country that is no longer run by Americans. And they could look at the globe and smack their lips and decide how it would be divided up. That was the importance of bringing the German space scientists to this country, that's written up very carefully in the book Project Paperclip, is that the satellites tell you where the water is, where the oils are, where the oil is, where the minerals are, where the vegetation is, where the population is, and then you control it by, if you see the oil, then you can go down after it. You can displace people who have property and buy it from them, and then dig your oil up. You know which countries have deposits of oils, and then you rearrange the population according to the oil picture. The war was over May the 8th, 1945, in Germany, and in August of 1945, the Americans dropped bombs in Hiroshima, Japan, in order to end the war quickly. And the reason they used those atomic bombs, they were made by Mr. Oppenheimer and Adolf Hitler. Oppenheimer describes them like a basket of pineapples. The reason they were dropped was to stop Russia from going into those oil deposits and into Asia any further. End the war so Russia would have no chance to go east. They had already gone west, and get the war over with. So the United States didn't manufacture the atomic bombs. They took those bombs. As a matter of fact, there'll be a movie made someday on that. I know the producer who has the documents from the National Archives from Washington, and there were tape recordings of Mr. Oppenheimer talking about those bombs, that they were Hitler's bombs that were used to end the war. And get those satellite scientists over here quickly, and get the satellites launched just as one is going up this week to check the oceans and keep control of all the oceans. So President Truman sat and looked at his little globe, but it took Richard Nixon to write it up in such a simple, descriptive manner that I think you all can understand. The book that has the information about the Swiss bank connection is by Leslie Walker. It's called The Swiss Bank Connection and has to do with the Nazi money in the Swiss banks. I put on the list that's enclosed for you, besides the Richard Helms covering up the Swiss banks, is information on a newsletter by Jim Horowitz. It's been going out for a long time. I was only at the home of Mr. Horowitz once. Don Fried was arranging a conspiracy conference in Los Angeles. I don't personally understand Mr. Horowitz. He worked with Mark Lane and Don Fried, and I felt that they've been much too quiet on a lot of information that should have gotten out, and suppressed information I had when I went down to that conference. But anything that we get out is better than nothing, and I think you should turn on to all of the pieces of the puzzle that are valuable. Just like I would say read Mark Lane's Rush to Judgment or Sylvia Maher's Accessory After the Fact. The fact that these researchers suppress more information, and we have to ask ourselves why, or I.F. Stone, I've been criticized for criticizing the fact that they sit on bombshells and let the world literally fall apart, is another subject for investigation. But if any information they get out is factual, use it. And I think if you have the money and inclination, or can share it with friends, get Jim Horowitz's newsletter. And I have here the issue number. He has volume 5, number 6, on Evelle Younger, Super Spy Part 2. And on the other side of this sheet, I have his address that I forgot to put on the one side. Now, Evelle Younger is running for governor of this state. The primaries will be this week against Ed Davis. One of them will get a national position. That's why they're running against each other, to get national prominence in the primaries. Jim Horowitz talks about Evelle Younger as being the czar of a California spy network called Organized Crime Collectors School, OCCS, which is actually an anti-terrorist Red Squad group that was formed, and as I said in my article, the SLA is the CIA. That they're no longer chasing communists. Our country's doing trade with Russia and Red China. They're not looking for communists. They're looking for terrorists, and terrorists will be the chance to open our mail, wiretap, break into newspaper offices now, survey people, do anything they want. The word is terrorism. Evelle Younger is in charge of this spy empire, and it's under the guise of like Howard Hughes or ITT. There's a private firm in Southern California called the ANACAPA Sciences Incorporated, ANACAPA Sciences Incorporated, which is described as a mystery firm hired for politically motivated paramilitary campaigns to get dissidents. Maybe you read this week about Zaire, that General Motors was sending in troops. The private corporations, the private companies work with the defense agencies and the CIA, so we don't have to declare war, and the FBI doesn't have to do half of its underground work. Mr. Webster said there were 80 informers right now on the terrorist work. But then these private corporations get the money from the government, so that the FBI can look at you and say, I only have 80 agents on this subject. But ANACAPA its cover is organized crime. Its purpose is to set up this is like the Gestapo, national training schools. They will work with local police officers. Adolf Hitler worked with Interpol. He had the best police system, and it was not only national, but it went to Vienna and Poland and Hungary and Romania. It became international. The SWAT teams are formed under this, and they want more SWAT teams for urban counterinsurgency and militarization of police forces. The headquarters are Los Angeles, California, with Daryl Gates of the Los Angeles Police Department, who was under Ed Davis. San Francisco, where we have Mr. Gaines, Charlie Gaines, who ran the FBI counterintelligence program in Oakland against the Black Panthers and should never have been made chief of police in San Francisco and Oakland. Those are the three centers. So Daryl Gates and Charlie Gaines have been part of this military FBI counterintelligence team through the whole Operation Chaos, Tom Charles Houston, plan, the things that I wrote in my article, the SLA is the CIA. Anna Kappa Company is linked to the Central Intelligence Agency. It shares with them their anti-terrorist money. Their project director is Jack Kinney of Air Force Intelligence and a top-secret National Security Agency executive, and also officers from the Office of Navy Intelligence, Defense Intelligence Agency, using reciprocal relationships with the CIA. Evelle Younger's influence reaches through the OCCS, Organized Crime Collectors School. Organized Crime Collectors School are black unemployed, Chicano unemployed, no jobs for them, stealing to get food, become criminals. This is your terrorists. There's going to be unemployment and riots in this country. There are no terrorists, really. There's going to be self-defense. That's the reason the Panthers started. But Younger works with this group, this Organized Crime Collectors School. That's what he calls it, and he's educating these people into this. And he also works not only with Anna Kappa, which is this mystery group in California, but they work in Washington, D.C., with a group called the PAA, Psychological Assessment Associates, PAA, which is a deep cover of the CIA proprietaries and houses that work with behavior modification and drug experiments. You see how you get a Donald DeFreeze working in Vacaville under the Defense Mind Control Program with Colson Westbrook, forming an SLA, the excuse to burn those people in Los Angeles, 06, they inaugurate the first SWAT team public television burning of what they call terrorists, using the courts. D.A. Browning, who prosecuted that case, who still hasn't prosecuted Emily and William Harris, 4 years now for kidnapping Patty Hearst, is running for Attorney General of the state of California, while the Attorney General is running for governor. They're linked to the mind control programs and one of Younger's liaisons in Washington. For their Psychological Assessment Associates, works under the cover, works with John W. Gettinger, an operator working under the cover of the Human Ecology Fund, known as a CIA conduit. Now, I've told many listeners on KLRB, I don't remember which show it was on because they're not that carefully put in table of contents. They should be someday. I should have somebody listening to them and typing them up. I told you 3 years ago, a man went to England and told me to get out of the country at that time. He told me about the radio towers used in San Francisco for mind control, that they can take whole cities and subdue them and break meditation. And he told me that ecology and energy crisis would be the excuse for eliminating 63 million Americans, according to a RAND study. Human ecology means to clean up the earth. Charles Lindbergh was into ecology. Charles Lindbergh was moving into Germany the day that Hitler went into Poland and thought maybe it would be bad for the American image and just stayed over in England. Ecology means, as Hitler said, by losing World War II, we get the mongrelization of races, and we lose years, eons of time, because then black GIs went into Germany and married white German women and so forth. When the war was lost, we were behind in the race. And Hitler's ecology program, of course, was the pure white Aryan race. And the Nazis will work with the Arabs and the Asians to a degree, or the South Africans, until they have total control. And eventually, through sterilization and mass programs of germs and genocide, white people, such in South Africa, which was an experiment after World War II, where a handful of whites could handle a bunch of blacks, and it works. People may object to Steve Biko being killed. 33 other men were killed in those prisons just this last year. There will be no leaders. Apartheid will remain. It's a test case, and it works. And there's no reason why these people can't continue their genocidal policy, and that is what is the Human Ecology Fund. This two-part article on Evelle Younger is so concise that I have given you the address of Mr. Horowitz, and I think that you should get his newsletter, and you should get his back copies, because it's a very important story about Evelle Younger's spy empire, because Evelle Younger has been an important man all along, ever since his early training in the military, and he's still linked a general in the military reserves. So get that from Mr. Horowitz, get that newsletter. I also have here a reference to a Life magazine, which I think would be interesting for those of you to look up. It's easy to get in the library. It's March 26, 1971, and it was an article about the Army, Navy, domestic intelligence. Now, I'd been doing research since November 24th, 1963, and when I went to see Jim Garrison in New Orleans, that's the time that I came home, and then my son had been given that acid, and I caught on to the deadly, dreaded mind control techniques that the U.S. government had. And when I came home from New Orleans in 67, that was in September, in November, that man named Charles Winnan moved right down below my house and next door to my friend Louise James. And those of you that have Dialogue Conspiracy have listened to the tape that I've had. Others of you would have to order it, about the trial with Charles Winnan, Paul Krasner, and Louise James and myself, the trial of Winnan versus Rolling Stones that's coming up in September in San Francisco. Now, I was watching the government. That's why I'm changing the title now to World Watchers. It's time that you and I not only have a dialogue, I call it Dialogue Conspiracy between the two of us, but we have a watching institution, whether it's 8 people in your home or 4 or 2 or whatever. We have to become world watchers, and you have to get more aware, as I was, all along of what was going on. So that I saved in 1971, maybe you missed it, hundreds of articles that came out at the time that Sam Ervin's committee caught on that the Army, Navy intelligence, and all forms of the FBI, the CIA, were surveying American citizens in 1971. When Watergate broke in 1972, a lot of people were surprised when I wrote the article, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped, the American Assassins, and How Nixon Came to Power, how I could have so much information which within 3 weeks of the arrest to write an article like that. The answer is it wasn't psychic, and the article didn't come easy, but it came fairly easy to write within that time period because I had been a world watcher for a long time. And I came across a batch of articles to help the lawyers and Paul Krasner in this case that were in my file that I thought it might be interesting to you. And if you go to your newspapers in your libraries in town on the microfilm of 1971, this whole era, in March, February, March, and April, and read about Army surveillance. First they said they were surveying 7,000 people. Then it was 14,000 people. Then it was 25 million people. That was a quarter of the American population that was under surveillance in 1971. But a typical example of surveillance is a page about Sam Ervin and his investigation, Life magazine, March 26, 1971, and they have a column there of excuses for the Army and Navy to do domestic surveillance. And among these articles, I say it said 25 million Americans under surveillance. Now, here were some of the people that fit a profile that we should be followed. And keep in mind that I was under surveillance from 1966 on, and this was 1971. And this is found in Life magazine. Quotes, anybody who went to the funeral of Martin Luther King should have a profile under surveillance. Anybody who was in the presence of Whitney Young. Whitney Young was a black civil rights leader that died swimming over in Africa, and they hushed up his death. And just recently they came out and said they had underwater guns. He died of a discrepancy of diagnosis visiting Africa. Anyone who was in the presence of Whitney Young would be under surveillance. So therefore, getting rid of a black leader fits into what I said was the King Alfred plan. Persons who changed their job or residence 4 times in the past 10 years. In other words, if you sat on a porch in Iowa or Kansas or in your apartment in New York and you weren't curious and you didn't leave and you didn't walk out of the office and you wanted to see what was going on in this country, a hippie that left home, somebody resisting the draft, curious about what they were doing in other states, organizations in other states, crossing lines, say to go to Chicago for the conventions, people getting it together and questioning and dropping out. People who changed their jobs or residence 4 times in 10 years were to be under surveillance. people who changed their hair in the past 2 years or had sideburns, any person who publicly objected to Richard Nixon's remarks at the time of the Charles Manson trial that Charles Manson was guilty. Now, why did they worry about Charles Manson? Or if you talked to an anti-war radical youth during 1970 anti-Cambodia rally in Washington, D.C. Get Life magazine, I've given you the reference here, March 26, 1971. And that's an example of what was happening around us at that time that fits into now. You're listening to me now. So take what I say now and project the future, because I can tell you the future in 71, and you can look up some of these articles. There's a magazine called 7 Days, which has a long article on black bags inside the FBI. I've given the date here so you can get it from your libraries or write to the magazine and order copies. I think that you should know that this is out. I don't have to detail past and present jobs of the FBI. You can get the sources from this issue. I'm reading a book now, Jacques. I've given the bibliography here. It's called The Men Who Betrayed France. It was put out by André Simon, the author, in 1940. It's called Jacques. It isn't about Émile Zola. It's about 200 people in France who, long before World War II, in the 30s, and actually probably in the 20s, decided that they would go along with this Nazification of the world, that the important thing was to stop what they feared, communism, specifically either ruling out the church's excuse for existence, the formal church as the Russians had done, or to rule out the royalty that Hitler wanted to put it back into power, the royal families in Europe had promised to do, or to divide the land, to break up the feudal land holdings of a handful of people. And if you read an article, it was on the front page of the Chronicle this last Sunday on Zaire. They said Mobil Oil has these investments, IBM has this investment, ITT has this investment, and they listed the millions of dollars of money that was in Zaire. And this tells you why we're in war. It's no longer important what it means to send people to die or to kill those black people or whatever. If the Americans have the investment for the plutonium or the minerals or the copper, we go there. And therefore they now print on the front page what the investment is, so the stockholder knows why he's in Zaire. And this book goes back to the 40s, and it's an important book. Get it if it's still in your library. If it's not, find it in old bookstores, but now you have a printout and you know where to refer to get that book, because that's the way this country is being given away. This has been going on since the Russian Revolution, when Hitler and the British, the American, the Italian, put Franco into power and made a push to collect and save their holdings, tighten them up, look at the globe, take a satellite to tell us where it's at, and fight for it. And people, no longer important. That was the importance of network, the moving network. When the radio and TV man is brought in, when he is told, you're no longer important, countries are not important, corporations are important. There's Dow Chemical, there's Standard Oil, there's ITT, there's General Motors. We don't think of countries or boundaries, and you have to forget thinking about that and being concerned about that. And Jacques is that kind of a book. It's a very good book about Daladier and Pétain and the Frenchmen who actually took the peasants and the innocent people and completely ignored them. One of the questions I got on a talk show that I did with Victor Bach last week at KLRB, we did an hour last week just talking about my going off the air, and people saying, do you believe that people in this country are capable of genocide? I know for sure they're capable of it. About 20, 30 million a year die of starvation and chemical deaths and cancers that could probably be traced to be purposeful. And I know they're capable of it, and they'll do it, and they're doing it. And we have to be always alert. Read Jacques, 7 Days, Life magazine, Between the Lines, and Inquiry magazine, and we'll be doing a more extensive bibliography on this program than I did before, so that you don't have to write back to me. You people have been writing and obtaining the information in literature, which is really great, and one of the reasons that I'm going out of the private tapes, this form of communication. But if you want more information to plug in, I'll keep giving you the sources so that you don't have to write back for it. It will save time, and you can begin to get some of the references if you're interested and if they're still available in the libraries, and if the libraries aren't closed after Jarvis Gann. The Jarvis Gann, of course, is the notorious Proposition 13 that's so controversial that we can talk a little bit further about on the other side, the meaning of those taxes. For those of you that just have this side, this is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It is June the 1st, 1978, and I will continue for the others for this week's news on the other side of this tape. Now you have your homework, and you can start doing your reading, look up some of this material in the library, and find some of these old books like Jacques Q's. And if you have some that you think I don't have, use bookstores or rummage sales or garage sales. I'd appreciate them if you buy them. I'll pay you for it. And these old books are very valuable, and I would appreciate them if you can find some for me sometimes. And good afternoon. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California, continuing number 325. The backside of this tape is 325, and it is recorded June the 1st, 1978 in Carmel, California, continuing into what I want to call the World Watchers International, to see what is going on in the world and share this information with you. When I went off the air, formally off of KLRB with the commitment of being on public broadcasting, or KZAP, or the other colleges that received this up at Humboldt, or different radio stations, and decided to go to this format of the cassette newsletter, I received a lot of telephone calls from people that are interested in organizing and meeting, and other people that want to continue to help me with the research. And I will keep you informed on the tapes of various things, of course, that I'm publishing and doing. I've been teaching some courses at Lutheran College, a college-accredited classes on the conspiracy, and may be doing a complete series in the fall. If I do, maybe we can tape record those sessions so that you could get those tapes if you want them, and it would be as if you were attending the class, and send you bibliography of the courses as they continue. I will be active, more active than I was before, and I'm certainly receiving a lot of information every day coming in. I'm just flooded with it. But I hope this new format works out and that you're satisfied with it, and that proof of your satisfaction will be an intensity or a activity on your part to get some of this information distributed among the people that you know and the public officials and candidates that are running for office and calling talk shows and writing letters to the editor. When I went to KLRB this last week to pick up mail and messages, there was a package for me there left by a man. He didn't have a return address on it, and his name was just scribbled. And it was a large yellow envelope, and they were wire service sheets. And he said, "Dear Mrs. Brussell, I'm delivering this in hopes that you'll be able to use it. It contains everything that went over the wire services of the military and civilian at the time that John F. Kennedy was killed. It's 2 days prior to his death, the United Press International Stories, and for some time after his death. It was collected by my father when he was in the military as a crypto officer and was inherited by me. I found it after he died. I hope you can use it. Love and Hope," and a name there which is just scribbled, which he obviously didn't want me to contact or thank him, get in touch with him on the matter. This is very important research. It's valuable to read it. I just read the first page in a UPI story. As soon as John Kennedy was killed, it stated John Kennedy was assassinated by 3 bullets, period. Now that is very interesting because there had not been an autopsy on the body. There had been no indication of how many shots came out. It's true that people on the street heard 3 shots, but certainly by 1963 the military was familiar with silencers. At Senator Church's committee, information came out about the umbrella being used as a weapon during this time period. Even before the 60s, they were developing those. And the car that John Kennedy was driving in, of course, was never photographed or examined from a standpoint of a murder taking place to see if there were bullets in the car or on the floor of the car or in the seat, or if the metal from the bullets that came in there matched the metal of the bullets in the body. The car was immediately destroyed. John Kennedy's body was taken out of Parkland Hospital against the laws of the police department to do the autopsy there, taken to Bethesda Hospital in Maryland, where Arlene Specter managed to get all the witnesses to fit their evidence and testimony that it was 3 bullets, the original story that the UPI carried at that moment. Dr. Hume in the Navy had to burn his original papers, or he did them, of his autopsy papers. He later fit all of his findings into the framework that it was 3 bullets and nothing else. The doctors of John Connally disagreed with this. They talked about the impossibility of the direction of the bullets in John Connally's wrist and thigh. John Connally's clothing was destroyed and dry cleaned purposely. John Kennedy's clothing was locked up and has never really, the fiber tests have never really been put to show whether there were entry or exit wounds. The bloody coat of John Kennedy's is in the National Archives, but I've never heard of anybody wanting to examine the holes for the directions. Even the autopsy pictures at the table when the body was there were never developed. So you see that the decision was made when Lyndon Johnson was there on Air Force One going back to Washington. He was told Lee Harvey Oswald did it alone. The UPI said 3 bullets did it. The Warren Commission was a total fraud and had to fit all of the testimony and evidence into this story. I appreciate what he left off, and of course I will try to get them typed up and be able to use this and share this information with you. On Dialogue Conspiracy number 321, May 14th, 1978, I did a program about Ingmar Bergman's movie The Serpent Egg, and I gave reasons for my going off KLRB, and partly it was because so many things were happening to people around me. They're still happening, and I am concerned they're happening to people that are contacting me, but for personal reasons that are on that tape, I decided to go off. And one of the reasons I mentioned was the incidences happening around me and my family. I mentioned Emmett Grogan, the man who ran the Diggers in San Francisco at the height of the hippie movement, and how he was at a particular agent's home where my son was just before, I believe that my son was poisoned. And Emmett Grogan was there, and Marvin got very upset with Emmett Grogan there because he remembered what happened to the hippies and the Diggers in San Francisco. So my son had left the place, and Emmett Grogan went on, and 6 weeks later, so he was found dead at the end of a subway in New York City. Now, I know Paul Krasner came up to San Francisco, and there was a wake and a big party celebrating, or can you use the word celebrating, so-called friends of Emmett Grogan got together and had a wake because of his death. And the Berkeley Bar wrote up about the wake, and there were several other articles about Emmett Grogan. But I didn't know until yesterday, I never had knowledge that Emmett Grogan had authored a book called The Final Score in 1976, put out by Ballantine Press, on the plutonium heist. There are a lot of books out on the plutonium nuclear bomb connection, and you see here my list of bibliographies that I'm enclosing now with Dialogue Conspiracy, that Tom Davis and Aptos, under the name of Research, carries these books. And he has a list of books on the plutonium nuclear bomb connections, Brothers in Blood, the International Terrorist Network, Hidden Terrors, and Operation Plumbat. There's books coming out about Karen Silkwood's death. But here is a book on that list by Emmett Grogan on the plutonium heist. And we know that Mr. Blair was writing a book on the oil conspiracy. In fact, he had completed it. And just when it was going to print and about to get out, Mr. Blair was dead. And he couldn't go around and push that book. That book got dropped. He couldn't expose the oil conspiracy. There's certain people like Garson Kanan and Ruth Gordon that get on talk shows over and over again. Not that they're not good people, but there's certain people that just seem to be allowed to live to talk about their books. But John Blair, when he wrote in 1976 The Control of Oil, also put out by Pantheon Press, he was dead. His book never did get out, in the same way that this book can't get out by Emmett Grogan. At least I keep up with books I didn't know was out, and the obituaries had no mention or connection of any investigation into plutonium missing, or the plutonium scene, with the possibility that that's why he died, just like Mr. Blair's death was never investigated as a possibility that it killed all promotion of his book. There is a movie coming out, I mentioned just quickly on my last program, or next to last, called Capricorn 1. It's advertised now. It'll be here playing in the major cities starting next week. And the advertising goes, "Would you be shocked to find out that the greatest moment of our recent history may not have happened at all?" And of course, if you have Dialogue Conspiracy, where I talk about the moonshot, that was number 287, October the 19th, 1977. We never went to the moon. And again, you can order that book that I used as a basis of that particular show, even though there are 2 new books out since then, and I've listed them for you also. Mr. Casing refers to that as America's $30 billion swindle. We never went to the moon. You can buy that book and read it. It's a very good book, and it has a lot of points from the standpoint of a scientist. I'm not a scientist. Mr. Casing is, and that's why he happened to write the book. There is an article in the Oregonian, Friday, March 17th, 1978, if you can get that paper. It comes from Portland, Oregon, that the Soviet Union has brought back rocks from the moon, the Lunar 24 mission, and they're not explainable. They're a composition never before found on the moon. They said they found, we've never found a high iron, low titanium, low traced element composition. I might have mentioned that to you before, I don't remember, but it's interesting if they were landing at the same place to come back with different kinds of minerals. And we will watch, I think the movie will be worth seeing. I'll see it, of course, and see how much information it gives out on the moonshot. Now, the propaganda machine never ends in the United States, and in order to be aware of what's going on, you have to have sources of information, direct sources and second sources, and I like to compare constantly documents I have to printed material. A lot of people say, what are your sources of information? And those of you that know my work know that there's a wide range of them. But I went into Long's drugstore this week and found a book which has been out of print for quite a few years, 6 or 7 years, and I know I assigned it as a textbook when Ray Fabrizio and I gave the course in Monterey Peninsula College on conspiracies, and it was no longer in print. And the name of the book is The Warren Report. Even though it was the most extensive book, investigation the government had ever done, they weren't proud enough to continue this book, to put all of the researchers down and at rest once and for all by referring to their book. So the Warren Report went out of print. The 26 volumes of exhibits and testimony upon which the report was based was limited, I think, to 8,000 copies right from the start, even though there might be a market for them today if the government printed them. But the Warren Report went out of print. So now it's 1978, and at Long's drugstore, which is a big chain like the Thrifties, and goodness knows where else they sell, you're lucky. You can buy the Warren Report, and I took it over to Carmel High School where I gave a class last week to show them what you could buy. Now, in the first place, it's a bargain. They have a bargain table where it says $5.95 reduced to $1.99. And Tom Davis, who has books out of research in Aptos, told me that these books were being sold at 60 cents to the bookseller. So you can see for 60 cents how nice it is to flood the country at a time of controversy into the assassination of John Kennedy and give people this Warren Report. But this book is not a first source of information, because the very first source of information for the researchers was published by the government printing office or by there were 2 other paperback volumes that came out, but they were identical in essence. And then there was Doubleday and Company, a private book publisher, which published the Warren Report with an introduction by the notorious Louis Nizer. Now, the thing about this Warren Report is that it's published by the Associated Press, which is an acknowledged, admitted conduit of the Central Intelligence Agency that has also been suspect in the assassinations. It has no address inside of where you would order another one. It just says printed in the USA and has a printing company. It's got no address, and it has no date. It's just put out for a very cheap price, for $1.99, for you to read the Warren Report. And then when you open the Warren Report and you turn to the section after the first investigative work is done and they go into the exhibits. Incidentally, there's no table of contents. No person can do research with this new book. There's no person in the United States of a second generation, because this is 14 years later, going on 15 years later, that can use this book for any investigative work. It has to be pure propaganda. There's no table of contents in the book at all. And when they get to Appendix 5, and this is important, of this new cheapy version, Appendix 5 has a list of witnesses before the Warren Commission. They state the following is a list of 552 witnesses whose testimony was presented to the Warren Commission. This is Appendix 5 of the new book. And Appendix 5 of the original Warren Report, even the one put out by Doubleday, has on page 483 a list of witnesses. And they say the following is a list of 552 witnesses whose testimony was presented to the Warren Commission. But the difference between the Warren Report, the original Warren Report that came out in 1964, and the Warren Report that comes out in 1978 is that one has the list of the volume number and the page number where you can find that testimony. In other words, there's been a lot of controversy about Sheriff Craig, who saw Lee Harvey Oswald leave from the front of the book depository, and there was a witness, Warnell, who saw him leave from the back of the depository. So you look up Craig in the original Warren Report, and it says Volume 6, page 260. But in this book, there is no page number or volume number. In other words, the Warren Report, the first original source of information, in the Section 5, Appendix 5, has the volume number and page number of every witness. So if you're studying this case and you hear about a person like Lydia Dimitri, you can look up Volume 9, page 60, because she was one of the most important witnesses before the Warren Commission. You can look her up and get her testimony at a library, and the original sources are there. Or George or Jean de Mohrenschildt, Volume 9, page 166 or page 285. But in the new cheapy version, they just have the names and they don't tell you about them, so that all you know is that Sheriff Craig is a sheriff. You don't know what he said to Lee Harvey Oswald in the offices of Captain Fritz after the assassination. He's just a name among 552 people. All it says is Roger Craig, witness at assassination scene. But if he saw Lee Harvey Oswald get into the car of Michael and Ruth Payne, and he says, don't get them involved because then everybody will know who I am, Sheriff Craig is an important witness, and therefore you can't find any information. Then you turn to the back of the original source Warren Report. The entire Warren Report was written with footnotes, and no matter how bad it was, you have Chapter 1 or Chapter 2. The first footnote in there is 4H 130. That means Volume 4 of the hearings on page 140 regarding Governor John Connally. Or you can find 7H 441, the testimony of Kenneth O'Donnell. And the original Warren Report goes from page 817 back to page 879. So that's 62 pages of footnotes with volume number and page number. And the cheapy version leaves all of that out. They don't leave it for you. And then the Warren Report, the original Warren Report, then has an index of names. And this has absolutely no index of names. So that the Associated Press, a known conduit of the Central Intelligence Agency, has come out with a cheapy book that people could hardly not miss and can't afford if they want it, and they're wholesaling them at 60 cents a book and calling it the Warren Report. The cover-up goes on and it's insidious and should be exposed, and people should be writing letters to the Associated Press, to the congressman, to wherever you take this tape, to the President of the United States, and say, this isn't free enterprise, this is propaganda. You're covering up a controversial issue. There's 170 books critical of the Warren Report, and news people can get on and write editorials and lambaste us or call us crazy or kooks if we investigate, And we can't turn you on to the sources because the original source of the Warren Report isn't available, and this cheapy version tells people a story that the government wanted implanted in their minds in 1963 and 1964. And in 1978, they're selling them out for 60 cents to be picked up for a couple of dollars and making it look like it was a $6 book. World Watchers International has people listening and subscribing to the tapes in the Yukon or in Ireland or France and England. A very good researcher, Harry Ervin, has been doing work in Belfast for many, many years, and he has a little newsletter. It's edited and published. If you want to write to Harry Ervin, Ravensdean Crescent, Ravenhill, Belfast, it would be nice to write and subscribe to his newsletter, and I will be talking all the time about the newsletters of Penn Jones and Sherman Skolnick in Chicago, his work. But Ted Gandolfo has written a brief article for the newsletter that you can send from Harry Ervin in Belfast. And Ted has summarized the relationship of the chief counsel of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, G. Robert Blakey, to the FBI and the CIA, and his relationship to Louis Nizer, who wrote the introduction to the Warren Report, which I have right here, and also to modalities of organized crime. Gandolfo wrote, in quotes, "The chief counsel of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, G. Robert Blakey, is a legal hitman for organized crime. He has permitted the committee in Washington to be captured by the FBI and the CIA," end quotes. I don't happen to agree with Ted Gandolfo that Mr. Blakey allowed the committee in there to be captured. I believe that the committee to investigate these assassinations was set up originally by members of the CIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the FBI, and that the succession from Henry Gonzalez through Mark Lane and Don Freed into encouraging Rusty Rhodes and these people to sign petitions to get a committee going, and then handing it over to Richard Sprague, who was a law partner in the District Attorney's Office of Arlene Specter, the same attorney that fit all the evidence into the 3-bullet story. He worked with him for 10 years, and then Mr. Sprague, through news leaks in the New York Times, through CIA, known CIA contacts in Washington Star, New York Times, caused Mr. Sprague to have an altercation with Henry Gonzalez, and then in comes Mr. Blakey. But that succession from Henry Gonzalez to Mr. Sprague to Mr. Blakey was called out by me step by step. He never thought that the time to open the investigation was when people like Bernard Fensterwald or George O'Toole and Mark Lane or Mr. Popkind or Mr. Oglesby, the AIB, when these people weren't willing to see all the information that was available, then it wasn't time to open it up. When the researchers agreed that these facts exist, we could have stood together and allowed a committee to form to give them the minimum demands, as I had put down in a position paper, of what constitutes a good committee. I have always mistrusted the people that were setting up the committee, and therefore why should I trust the committee? But getting back to Ted Gandolfo's allegations or comments in the JFK Assassination Forum article, which is a good article, he says that the key figure in the surrender of the Select Committee is Robert Blakey, its present chief counsel. In charging that Blakey had odd and recent connections with organized crime characters, Ted Gandolfo claimed in February 1976 that Robert Blakey associated himself with Mo Dalitz, one of the early activists with organized crime in America. On that date, Gandolfo substantiated that there was a sum of money that Mr. Robert Blakey sold his expertise to Mo Dalitz as an expert in the area of organized crime, that money was transacted, and that Blakey refused to say how much money he received in legal fees working with Mo Dalitz. What isn't in this forum, in this article by Ted Gandolfo, is the reminder that Mo Dalitz worked with Robert Mayu while Mayu was heading up these assassination teams. That Robert Mayu stayed at the home of Mo Dalitz, and I have that on documents. They were in the hotel room when Howard Hughes, the body substituted for Hughes, was brought in 1976. Mayu stayed at the home of Modales and worked with him, simultaneously with the assassination teams of John Rosselli and Sam Giancana on organized crime. Blakey, now heading the House Select Committee, did legal work with Modales, and he refers all of his questions about his relationship to Modales now to his attorney, Louis Nizer, the same man who wrote the introduction to the Warren Report that claimed that anybody who questioned the Warren Report was really deranged, but more serious than that, than calling us neurotics. Louis Nizer used cover stories put in by, again, agents of the Nazi Gehlen operation to discredit Lee Harvey Oswald and make it believable that he would assassinate John Kennedy. Louis Nizer, because of his prestige as a famous New York attorney, was brought in to write the introduction to the notorious Warren Report, not the one printed by the New York Times or the government printing office. They didn't use his introduction, but the one published by Doubleday and Company in 1964 has an introduction of Louis Nizer, and I had charted out in that introduction one lie after another lie after another lie, not based on any fact that was going to be in the Warren Commission hearings or the testimony or the evidence. It didn't support his introduction, and he wrote it. And Louis Nizer is the attorney that you speak to if you want to know why Robert Blakey, the chief counsel for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, does work and gets paid by Modales of organized crime. Blakey was recommended for his position as a committee member by Congressman Christopher Dodd. This is in the newsletter, an article by Ted Gandolfo, who was a law partner with FBI Director L. Patrick Gray. Now, Christopher Dodd's father was the gentleman whose photograph was on the back of that record Lee Harvey Oswald made for military intelligence when he was in New Orleans area claiming he was a Marxist. And Congressman Dodd was sitting with Hale Boggs before the Warren Commission was formed, and Boggs was to be on the Warren Commission talking about the communists that killed John Kennedy. It's Christopher Dodd who put Mr. Blakey on the Warren Commission while he had been a law partner with indicted former FBI L. Patrick Gray. I was the first person to publish in August of 1972 that Patrick Gray should not investigate Watergate because he had covered up the ITT scandal, the killing of Jerry Lee on May in Los Angeles, the provocateur terrorist right-wing Isla Vista riots in Santa Barbara, the Charlie Manson military intelligence terrorist operation, the 7 murders in Los Angeles. He was covering up murders in Los Angeles that I wrote about, and I didn't know at the time that L. Patrick Gray had been a law partner of Christopher Dodd, and now Dodd put Blakey on the committee. Gandolfo wrote many of the most frightening and recurring questions presented by the John Kennedy and Martin Luther King assassinations are those dealing with the roles of the intelligence agency. The Church Committee revealed their criminal excesses and their close cooperation with organized crime. And then he claims to say that Richard A. Sprague, who was a guest on his show, told me that he refused to yield to the intelligence services. But that would be yet to be seen. There's Richard E. Sprague, the writer, and Richard A. Sprague was the investigator, the district attorney working under Arlene Specter in Pennsylvania. I have nothing to say about Mr. A. Sprague in terms of his honesty or dishonesty. His claim to fame was prosecuting Tony Boyle, and even that went to another trial. But there wasn't anything great on killing the mine leader, Mr. Yablonsky, and his family, because the people involved said from the beginning, Tony paid us and Tony did it. So that wasn't the greatest scoop or investigation in history. So I don't agree, carte blanche, that we would have gotten a better investigation out of Arlene Specter's law cohort in Pennsylvania than Mr. Blakey. I think it's 6 of one and half a dozen of another. Again, if the people setting up the investigation are covering primary evidence and are in collusion of conspiracy, why would they be ready for an investigation, and what difference who covers it? Ted Gandolfo wrote that the rules of the committee, formulated with the assistance of Congressman Don Edwards of the Constitutional Civil Liberties Committee, has been flagrantly violated under the leadership of Chairman Louis Stokes and Counsel Blakey. They subpoenaed a witness, Robert McEwen, who couldn't have his own attorney present, and who has abused, they've insulted and threatened other witnesses. They're not allowed a recording or a transcript of their testimony. They're not permitted a public hearing. Jerry Ray and James Earl Ray were told they may not have an attorney of their choice when they go before Mr. Blakey. Their sister was told she may not have a counsel. Louis Nizer, as the attorney of Mr. Blakey, should make it quite evident, based upon the way he handled the Warren report then and the reason we're investigating it now, that Blakey should be off that committee. Now, I hope the people that take these tapes will sit down and write a letter to Mr. Robert Blakey. No, don't write to him. Write to President Jimmy Carter, the White House, and say we thoroughly disagree with the techniques and tactics of spending taxpayers $2 million to investigate the assassination of John Kennedy and the assassination of Reverend Martin Luther King. And we believe that this investigation is a fraud. We are researchers, or we are concerned citizens. We are world watchers, international. And we want the record to show that you cannot come back later and say that in 1977, 1978, the federal government under the House Select Committee did an investigation. The Warren report was a fraud and led to the Watergate exposés. The Watergate Senate Select Committee was a cover-up. It didn't do its job. It led to the Rockefeller Committee on the CIA that got too hot. They closed that up. It led to the Senator Church Committee, and now this fraudulent committee. Write to the President of the United States. Keep a carbon of the letter. Send me a copy, and we'll continue next week with our news account for you world watchers. I hope this format works out for you, getting an hour a week of news with a printed sheet out, and I hope we can spread the information around the country to friends and relatives and concerned people. I'll be sending another tape next week. This is June the 1st, 1978, Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. Here, the next tape will